question about bhakti always arises. And again, one of the things that I would ask is when the person uses this term bhakti, what does that mean for the person? What understanding of bhakti are you employing in a certain sense? And to what degree, is that understanding perhaps shaped by particular traditions and shaped by particular practices from those alternate traditions? It's always been puzzling to me that Abhinavagupta in particular, but certainly the entire Shakta-Shaiva tradition, was somehow tinged with this almost a kind of indictment that it was so heady. Abhinavagupta, in his writing, exemplifies this state of ecstatic, ecstatic awakened devotion of an ultimate sort. How that devotion deploys itself may look different. I think that in the West, many times we've gotten used to a kind of opposition between knowledge and devotion. We find, even in the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, this widespread text, that teaches these three yogas, as it were, the karma, bhakti, and jnana yoga, and so on, that there is this kind of disparity or opposition or contrariness between knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of devotion. And then, I think that it is the case that historically speaking, in ancient and medieval India, it was really after the great millennium of the so-called Shaiva age that then the rise of the so-called Bhakti traditions, which arose primarily in the Vaishnava context, and you get different definitions of Bhakti, of Krishna Bhakti, Rama Bhakti, etc., and so on, that have particular practices, Nama Sankirtana, etc., and so on, different kinds of expressions, and of course a whole different ideology and a whole different focus on mantra, etc., and so on, that then seem to antagonize in a certain sense or even criticize the preceding Shaiva traditions as not having had any of that, which of course is completely false. The entirety of Abhinavagupta's life was a life. He was born a devotee. He speaks about his own parents as ultra devoted. He loses his mom, very early in his life. It's one of the tragedies of his life that he speaks about in his writings. But nevertheless, he's a Shaiva Bhakta in that way. And now, what that looks like, what that entails, that ecstatic feeling of divine love that is then expressed or animated or activated in a great variety of different ways is a separate consideration. But his whole being is he speaks about, there's one phrase that comes from the tradition, Parama Ananda Amrita Atmika, composed of the nectar of supreme bliss. More bhakti than that. It's what is the entirety of the path about? It is that locating of the Parama Ananda, the Parama Amrita, the supreme nectar of the bliss of the absolute consciousness, to be directly and immediately lived in one's own being, to be infused with that, to be nourished with that, to be rendered ecstatic by that, to have these impulse rays of that supreme bliss continuously surging and animating the entire being of the person, and that leads the person in terms of the way that they pursue their life. Devotion that animates disciplined action and disciplined yoga in a certain sense, and that also activate reverence and celestial perception and the vision of the divine altogether omnipresently, and so on. The vision of universal sacredness, the all-pervading vision of the living Shakti unfolding, waving in her potency everywhere in life. These are all forms of the inner highest expressions of bhakti, which may not necessarily be seen outwardly are displayed, sort of publicly in outward, sort of showy displays of devotion, but may in fact be sort of protected in the the inner temple of the heart, but that come across in Abhinavagupta's words. It's impossible to really read Abhinavagupta and not realize that you're listening to the words of this heart, inflamed devotee of Lord Shiva, of the goddess, someone who also lived in perpetual devotion to his teachers, of devotion, of being drenched in divine love, and also of the progressive opening of our inner vision to sequentially more and more interior spaces within ourself, where ecstatic revelation of ultimate mystical vision progressively reveals itself to our inner vision and drenches our individuality and tinges itself and saturates itself in our action, in our speech, in our attitudes, in our understanding, in our interpretation of life. So devotion, bhakti is everywhere in this tradition. And we should understand that, for these great beings, their study of the Shastra was essentially animated as a form of devotion in action. They were not merely studying dry texts that were boring or philosophical only, or that were sort of, lacking in rasa, lacking in that mysterious flavor of bliss. They were studying these texts because they were already in a blissful devotional mood, and they were then uplifted further in their understanding that devotion, is not something that is limited just to, quote, the heart. It's also something that infuses itself in the mind and that organizes, sublime precisions of understanding and precisions of mappings of the mystical path and of the service of humanity by the orderly and precise sequentiality of the displays of those highly useful, highly effective mystical paths that lead an individual to be able to replicate the great attainments of the past Siddha masters within their own life. Bhakti is everywhere, and we have to understand that, if anything, the knowledge is secondary. Abhinavagupta was an ecstatic, enlightened being. He's described in that way. He was seen as someone who lived in that condition of steeped in natural ultimate bhakti. And the tradition, he also, he did make these distinctions. He talked about para bhakti and apara bhakti, sort of the external forms of bhakti, and then really what is the highest bhakti, which is, enlightenment itself is the living of bhakti. Enlightenment itself, yes, is also the living of constant bhavana, of constant insight, of constant wisdom, and so on. But it's not some dry state. As we pierce in our deep meditation practice in particular, closer and closer and closer in orbit around the great vortex wheel, the Shakti Chakra, as we come into alignment with that great vortex wheel more and more, we are absolutely pierced by feelings of extraordinary love that just explode within us, and that really are overwhelming in their intensity. Many times they're sometimes difficult to hold and to contain, but we discover, and that the self is love bliss, and that the word ananda means as much love as it means bliss. So I always have a little bit of a strong statement that I want to make about bhakti, because I felt that, so-called Kashmir Shaivism has often been sort of pawned off as well. It's so technical, and there's so many technical terminologies and all this stuff. If Abhinavagupta was anything, he was an ecstatic devotee of the great goddess. So yes, this is a tradition of bhakti. It may have a different format. It may have a different ideology. It may look different. The bhakti is sometimes contained, or also because it is so precious, it is protected. It is not necessarily exposed to the casual view of the world in that way. But and yes, it does not create an opposition with the mind. It is the fusion. If we call the mind one thing and the heart another thing, it is the fusion of those two things. Ultimately, In the highest understanding, love unifies. And at the highest mystical level, um, the unifying force of the bhakti of the near total enlightened masters is what ultimately overcomes duality. Duality itself is unified into non-duality by the force of love that is surging in these beings who are almost enlightened, but who enter finally into the highest state of the Shiva Vyapti, not on the basis of any separate practice, but on the basis of what is surging inside them as the unifying force of love altogether. So the overcoming of duality and non-duality is itself something that the mechanism, if we can use such a crude word, of that attainment is stationed in devotion, in bhakti, in love. When one reads Abhinavagupta, I've spent my entire adult life reading Abhinavagupta. It's, it one cannot help but recognize that everything he wrote emerged from his bhakti, his love for the whole thing. It wasn't just pure, harsh kind of intellectual in that way. It was etched in kind of the ecstasy of the goddess everywhere, just drenched in it. So this is the tradition that we have. It's very, very beautiful. It's very subtle. It's very potent. And, you know, I think even sometimes people feel, oh, meditation practice is dry. Meditation practice is not dry. Meditation practice leads us to those interiormost states and places where exquisite, uh, natural upsurges, agonies of love, in a certain sense, arise inside us. We have to permit all of that inside us. Sometimes it's hard to contain, it's hard to hold the overflow of all of it.